Welcome to Confessions of a Cyberpsychologist. I am Carolyn Freeman, and today I am chatting with Dr. Melissa Lunardini and Tara Steele about the potential psychological impact of grief bots. Melissa is an international psychologist, the chief clinical officer at Help Desks, founder of Radical Grief, and has worked with children experiencing grief, loss, and bereavement for almost 2 decades. Tara is the director at Safe AI for Children Alliance, a leading woman in AI 2025, a member of the International Association for Safe and Ethical AI, and she also has a first-class law degree and is a former intelligence officer in criminal law enforcement. Welcome, Melissa and Tara. I'm so delighted to have you on board.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
I'd love to start with chatting through your personal journeys and what the pivotal moment was that shaped your focus. Melissa, can I start with you? And can you talk a bit about your background and what drew you into the field of child bereavement and grief support?
Yes, while I was in early studies in my early 20s, I took a death and dying course. And up until then, I had only had a few people in my life die, some uncles and aunts. And so I didn't really think about childhood bereavement much at all. But in this death and dying course, I had a woman come in and share a video. And after that video, and it was all about childhood bereavement. After that video, I remember being in the front row, crying my eyes out and just feeling really called to volunteer. And so I started volunteering for a year, working with bereaved children and teens. And I just fell in love with the work and with the raw vulnerability that children extend to us if we know how to hold space properly for them. And that was it. I switched careers. I was a teacher before that. And so I switched careers and started my death, dying, and bereavement journey when I was 24. And I am now significantly older than that and have loved every second of being able to hold space and work with this population.
That sounds amazing. And Tara, your work bridges technology policy and child safety. Can you talk about what got you started in the world of responsible AI, especially considering you have a background in law and intelligence?
Yeah, so it's, I guess it hasn't been a direct journey. I think that background in intelligence, that's more sort of shaped how I think in terms of like identifying risks and spotting the kind of trajectory things are on, that kind of thing. So I think because I'd sort of shaped my thinking that way, when I then found out about all of the issues going on with AI, particularly with children, I think it was kind of inevitable that I would really hone in on that because the risks are just so significant. And then the legal aspect, that's helped like identifying where policy and legislation comes into managing that space. But then in terms of like the literal journey, once I'd identified that interest, I then did a course in AI governance and safety, started to appreciate the wider scale risks, and then realised very, very few people were talking about the risks to children. And it's really the most significant risk because they're the future, and this is all about the future.
That's a really good point because there's a lot of talk about social media and teens and children, but not very much has been spoken to date about AI and children and teens.
Yeah, I think it's just all come along so quickly. Although behind the scenes, obviously, it's been in development for a long time. The sort of massive explosion since ChatGPT, we just haven't had time to put processes in place and to really get our heads around what's going on. And day by day, it's just developing so fast. And that in itself makes the risks to children even greater because we adults don't quite know what's going on. So that's the problem.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing is we don't know what's going on. It's just like the shiny new toy and we're just playing with it and it looks amazing and it's creating the stuff and we're not considering, well, actually there's a lot of stuff happening and that has unintended consequences. And this is part of that conversation around the unintended consequences of it. So Melissa, let's get chatting about grieving. What's unique challenges do grieving children and teens face, and how has your work helped create kind of new support systems for them?
Yes, that's a really good question. We like to call children and teens like digital natives, right? They know the landscape much faster than adults do. But when it comes to the unique challenges when children are grieving, it really depends developmentally, really, at the end of the day, right? So younger children definitely have some vast differences in their developmental ability to understand dying and death. And then as we move towards pre-adolescent and adolescent age youth, we see that they have a better finite understanding that death is final, for example, that there's this permanence that happens, very much like an adult would understand death. But that doesn't mean that the risks for grieving children are vastly different than adults. So children still have high risk of developing chronic health conditions. You think obesity, diabetes, things like that are still very much a part of the grieving journey for children's risks. Mood disorders, anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation or intent, relationship strain, academic challenges, engagement in risky behaviors, whether that is substance use or driving really fast without your seatbelt on, or even sexual engagement that could lead to unwanted pregnancies, behaviors that might lead to early incarceration. These are all things that we also can see in adults who engage in maladaptive coping strategies. I think the difference really goes back to one of the biggest challenges that I think a lot of professionals face when working with grieving children is that there is this myth from adults that children have this innate ability to be resilient. And by that logic, if we just think that children are resilient, we then can logically not offer adequate support because we believe that they have this innate capacity to bounce back. But what we know, and we know this from children who have mood disorders or are incarcerated or struggle in a lot of ways, there isn't this innate ability to be resilient. Resilience only comes with an action plan when people are stepping up and actually providing adequate and proper support. And so I think about the work that we do, part of creating support systems that really work is including children and teens in the design work of that support system and what that looks like for them, and making sure that we are not directing their work per se, saying that we know better, we know what you need, right? Instead of going like, tell us what would be supportive to you and let us try to create those systems that work for you. Because I feel like with chatbots in particular, and I know we'll get to that in a second, chatbots are doing a lot right when it comes to meeting the needs of supporting grieving children, youth, and adults. And there's a lot for us to learn from what they're doing right, even though there's a lot that could go wrong in the process. But there are some foundational emotional things that chatbots are doing right that as a society we can learn from. And so I would say, really when thinking about support systems, asking children, what is supportive to you? And then how can we start to exhibit those behaviors and approaches to care?
That's really interesting that you say, because I've heard people say that as well, is that children are really resilient and they'll get over stuff. They kind of bounce back. It's almost like a ball. They'll easily bounce back. Either that or they just kind of don't quite know how to deal with children or what do they need. So they almost kind of ignore them. And so it seems like there's two extremes of either completely ignore them or just say, oh, they're resilient, they'll be fine. Or as you say, tell them what they have to do or tell them what they need rather than actually asking them. Why do you think we as adults think that way about children?
I've worked with just hundreds of thousands of parents at this point, and caregivers in particular can exhibit quite a few different approaches to grief care. I think the most dangerous is the grief avoidant approach, meaning that I think that my child is too young to understand what's going on, or I think that in order to protect my child from experiencing more pain about me talking about it or showing my own grief reactions, I'm going to withhold that from them and let them sort of grieve in this vacuum on their own. And often children utilize play and are less likely to vocalize their feelings and what they're going through. And so parents will just think, well, they're just not grieving, right? They're not exhibiting the same behaviors that I would, so therefore I just think that they're fine. But what we know from the child development perspective, and then also just with grieving children, they're deeply grieving. There is this awareness that, even with young children who don't have the capacity to verbalize, they recognize goneness. They recognize that somebody was present and now they're no longer here. And there is an innate, we all experience grief. There is this innate reaction and response to loss that we all go through. And so we don't get to usurp that with children just because of our own inability to understand what children are going through. And I think parents can often, or caregivers can often take a different approach. The right approach, as we know, is to be transparent, open, honest, have conversations, continually bring their loved one up and check in often over the developmental periods of time as a child ages, is obviously the ideal approach here.
Which means that if those people who kind of are ignoring children or sidelining them or saying they're too young may then expose children to the possibility of, well, I have to find some outlet, I have to find some help, so I'm going to turn to AI. So, Tara, what was the inspiration behind founding the Safe AI for Children Alliance? And what have some key learnings been so far, thinking about how children are kind of starting to be exposed to AI, and that we're not monitoring this whole process of their use of AI?
Yeah, so I think the sort of inspiration behind it, aside from like the literal path I mentioned of like doing this AI governance course and deciding to go for that focus, like more like an emotional inspiration is just I've always been quite passionate about children's well-being. Like I'm on a school governing board, and then most significantly, I've got two children, two girls of my own. So I think just as a parent, just as someone who cares about children, when you sort of see the significance of these risks, your innate reaction is to want to reduce those risks, do something about it. So that's the inspiration behind it. That's why I've done it. In terms of key learnings so far, the thing that comes immediately to mind really is how much my appreciation has grown of what a big space, what a big void this was that needed to be filled in terms of addressing these risks to children, and how many people are so determined to make a difference in this space, and want to step up to make a difference, which is gives me a lot of hope. So yeah, it was sort of this like, wow, I'm far from alone in this. This is amazing kind of thing.
That's fascinating that you just said children are stepping up into the space and wanting to be involved. Is it that from the perspective of wanting to help regulate AI or just understand how AI is used?
So, sorry, did you say children wanting to be involved?
Yeah, I thought you'd said
Okay.
children wanting to be involved. You say people.
Saying loads of people wanting to be.
Okay.
But you are right though. I have also been contacted via parents, via schools, about children wanting to be involved more in this. That is absolutely true. Like you were saying, Melissa, in terms of as adults, sometimes making certain assumptions about what's best for children, even though we have that role, like we need to look after them, it is really important actually to involve them in appropriate ways. So you're totally right. And children have been wanting to do that more and more.
And I wanted to chat to both of you about grief bots, because you come from slightly different perspectives on the subject, and I thought it'd be really great to have a discussion on this. And because not everyone has heard of grief bots, I was wondering if you could define what these are and kind of in what contexts you think people would be using them.
Grief bots, also known as dead bots, they can be called dad or mom bots, they can be called versonas, virtual personas. They're all, from my understanding, computer-generated avatars that can mimic the likeness of your deceased loved one or a companion of your choosing. And it can be, these dead bots and grief bots can be static, meaning that you just feed it certain information and it only has the capacity, it has limited capacity to answer questions. Or it can use generative AI and large language models to really use pattern recognition to formulate how and speculate how your loved one might respond to interactions. And that's where it starts to get, I think, where the regulated piece starts to come in a really important way, because we can then see where it can get dangerous in people when these grief bots start to kind of formulate their own ability to kind of answer questions in an unregulated and unprompted way.
What's your thinking on that, Tara?
Yeah, I think that's really the most significant part, is that those responses, once you get beyond those ones that you talked about, Melissa, that are more structured, moving on to the ones that are much more AI driven, they're generating their responses based on the training data, which can be a narrow amount or a much bigger amount. But those responses are in no way pre-programmed. We don't know what those responses are going to be, what they're going to look like. We don't know if they're going to be factually correct. We don't know if they're going to be emotionally intelligent. And it's this simulation of a two-way relationship with someone who's passed away. I mean, you just know from hearing about it that there's a huge red flags going off there in terms of those risks to children.
Tara, what are children mostly using bots for at the moment?
So general AI companions, children are mainly just using those for chatting and for companionship, but also talking through problems, these kinds of things. And while that might seem like a reasonable idea, and I can sort of hold an appreciation of in the future as a concept, these can have some uses. Right now, children are having these conversations, and those AI companions that they're using, and this can apply to grief bots as well, but generally AI companions are frequently coming back with some really, really dangerous responses, like advising the children to do dangerous things, just saying completely inappropriate things. There are no meaningful safeguards in place, really, for the companion bots that most or many children are starting to interact with on a daily basis, and really highly addictive as well. Like, they're designed for engagement. There are just so many problems with them.
Do you think they are getting worse in terms of the feedback, the more that they kind of are self-training, the AI bots, because they obviously use the data that's inputted into them to train themselves? Do you think they're getting worse, or do you think they get better, or it's not quite clear yet how they're changing?
I don't know about that in terms of based on the data they're given. I suppose what I would say is that the AI models in general, like the large language models, are just getting more and more sophisticated. So one thing that almost certainly will happen as we go forward is that they will become more sophisticated and more better able to simulate a real relationship. It will become more and more like a genuine two-way relationship. And those little tells that we might have seen in the past are pretty much gone already. But yeah, that's certainly one thing that's going to happen going forward. So I hesitate to say that's better, but a more sophisticated model. But what we aren't seeing evolve alongside that is appropriate safeguards and an ability to interpret the model sufficiently to understand what it's going to say to a child.
Do you think that they probably need a bit more digital literacy and understanding what happens to them, and because I'm assuming that they will believe a lot of what's being told them and almost feel as though it's a human on the other side, not an algorithm?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Melissa, you would be better, far better equipped than I am to answer that in a more knowledgeable way. I suppose the first place I come at it from is I can feel it myself. Even when I talk to, I don't use AI companions, obviously, but even just interacting with Claude or whatever, there's very literal awareness that I know it's a large language model, but I still am aware of this feeling as an adult. And I think for a child, that's just hugely amplified, this feeling that it's a real person or a real thing that has real feelings and real understanding. But yeah, as I say, Melissa, you're much better placed to answer that question in a better way than I am.
Yeah, I think one of the first places that I come from it at is with how advanced AI is, just being able to go to ChatGPT, we start to not have to use or lean on our critical thinking skills as often, right? We just innately build this trust instantly that the information that we're receiving is accurate, honest, and has our best intention in mind, or is really trying to help us in some way. Particularly if you've ever used it for homework, for example, right? You're just like, this is going to help me so that I can, finish my assignment. And so there's this trust that gets built pretty quickly with this model. And I think digital literacy courses should be mandatory in all school curriculum immediately. It probably is a little late, to be honest, right? And so, but there should be one of the biggest policies pushes that we need to actually, advocate for is in grade school, primary, secondary school, we need to really make sure that every student is taking a digital literacy course so that they can understand the nuance. I mean, we're also seeing that with deep fakes, right? A lot of students have been a victim of a deep fake that has gone, and it's a different form of bullying, but it causes the same level of distress. Some argue even more distress for students, particularly if they were shown in a vulnerable state that may or may not be accurate, right? And so really teaching children the ethical side of things, but then also how do you detect misinformation. And I do think that it is just imperative, if we were going to spend our time advocating anywhere, it is, we know that these big tech companies ethically do not care about the consumer on the end. They care about getting into the consumer's pocket, right? And so the likelihood of us changing from the top down is going to be a tough battle, right? And so the logical sense then is educating from the bottom up. Even though ethically it goes against everything we ever talk about, right? It's like, no, it shouldn't be the responsibility for children and their caregivers to have to make these choices and learn. It should come the other way. But in societies that are run by privatized companies that just have endless amounts of money and power, it is an uphill battle.
Yeah, totally agree that education has to be there for children in terms of the digital literacy, but also in terms of the risks, just making them aware of the risks and their parents and caregivers and educators aware of those risks, because we're like you say, we're lagging really far behind on that. And while we could talk about how we wish it were and what the approach should be, it's like, here we are, so let's look at what we have to do.
I wonder if a lot of that digital literacy needs to be towards parents and caregivers, simply from the perspective that we kind of think children are resilient and we just think they're getting on with life, and don't have that same level of schoolyard information that children have access to. So they have friends who have access to a lot of different software and internet access, and they're always talking about this stuff and always experimenting. Whereas adults, we don't really have that same level of sharing of information. So we kind of slightly more clueless as to what's going on, and clueless in some ways as to the implications of that. So I wonder if parents and caregivers need as much, if not more, digital literacy in understanding the impact and the implications of the technology use.
Yeah. I would even argue, even professionals. So I've been in the grief, death, and dying space for 20 years. I've known that AI, is going to be a very integrated part of grief work for several years. But when you get at conferences and you get with these world-renowned leaders in the space, there is this refusal to want to talk about the intersection of grief and technology. And it's because perhaps they just don't feel like it's something that they would ever lean on as a tool in their own practice or in their own direct care. But that doesn't absolve you from being curious and knowing about what is happening in the space with or without you being involved, right? And so I'm like, how are we not just completely talking about this all the time and putting our brain powers together and creating these guardrails that we think are best practices for working with vulnerable populations like the grieving population, and really being at the forefront of all conversations? Why are we not the loudest people in the room here? And it's just ironic that there is this sort of inability or unwillingness to actually want to talk about what is already happening. Like the chasm has already been crossed, right? So we are not going backwards. It is just going to get more and more integrated with or without your support, right? And so wouldn't you want to be the curious person that we always teach professionals to be, right? Remain curious, right? But when it comes to technology, we're like, it's not for me. I'm not a tech person. It's like, well, you don't have a choice.
Yeah.
You do have a choice, but you will be left behind.
Yeah, it's like that same sort of thing. Like you can't act in the way that you wish it were. It's like it is here, so everyone does need to learn about it. Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree, absolutely, and that's across the sphere. Is that the older generation who operates in a very specific way? It's almost like not ignorance, but a fear of. And I hear that so often. Well, I'm not a tech person, so I'll let someone else do it. But actually, you need to do it.
Yes.
And you're right, you do have a choice. And if your choice is to not engage, that you will be left behind. And then talking about technology and grief bots and the grieving process, how does kind of children and adolescents grieve differently to adults? And then how do you think they would interact with the bots, grief bots, during various stages in the grieving process?
Yes. Okay. So, in order to keep this segment very condensed, because children and teens grieve substantially different than adults. However, there is always some crossover, right? And the thing I will go back to is it's all dependent on their developmental stage. And so, younger children, I would say children under the age of 7, I would imagine 7-year-olds, because again, they're digital natives, are also having the ability and a curiosity about what an AI companion can look like, right? Whether or not they instantly go to a grief bot after, say, their parent dies is a probably a larger leap, just because they would have to really do some research to get there. But still, I mean, as somebody who's age 7 or below, right, they do struggle with the idea of permanence. And like, so when somebody dies, they might still kind of really believe that their person has the capacity to come back in some form. And they might, really have, like, in terms of grief symptomology, they're more somatic based, and so they're less likely to be able to identify feelings and then verbalize those feelings. And so again, they often look like they are grieving well, and children of that age grieve through play. So the fact that they are using technology as a form of play, and then I would argue grief. I worked with a pair of teens their dad died by suicide, and they were twin boys, and they were 13, and one twin boy loved coming to support groups, did well, that was his jam. The other teen boy hated support groups, but he loved gaming. And the mother was so concerned about his well-being, because she's like, all he wants to do is game. It's like, I'm really worried about him. And so I basically suggested to the mother, you know what? As long as you sit and play games with him, and there is still this physical connection of you being in space with him, that is still supporting him in his grief. And then, they ended up we have something called Comic-Con here, and he found the video game developer and was just like, my dad died a year ago, and I want you to know that your game really helped me grieve. It's like, okay, that's a really appropriate way to process grief while a parent and caregiver is still present and in tune, right? Be totally different context if that parent was disengaged and this kid was just gaming in isolation to get his grief work done, right? But because she did engage and play, even though she wasn't a gamer, it wasn't about that, right? It was about just sitting in space with him and being present with him. And so those are, just an example of how children can utilize gaming or screen time as a place to go in and process grief, and that is okay so long as there is a companion piece that goes along with it, right? But to do it solely in isolation is where it gets problematic, where, as Tara said, there's this dependency that starts to develop, and we then become way more dependent on what a screen can provide for us emotionally than what humans can. And we know that the gold standard will always be the ability to hug, right? The ability to embrace your child or, your friend, the ability to show up and bring them a coffee or a snack of their, that's their favorite thing. Like AI is never going to be able to replace that. And we know that that is one of the number one protective factors when it comes to grief, right? When we look at the research, it's very clear. In order to adaptively move through grief, you need connection. And the connection has this physical component that AI will never be able to provide.
But we know, or from what you've been saying, is that there are parents and caregivers who kind of just say, well, the child is doing fine, they're resilient, we're just going to lead them to it, and they're obviously not aware of what's going on. Do you think that children may be using grief bots to supplement therapy, or as a standalone system, or kind of, and do you think in that they might help or hinder the grieving process?
Yeah, I do. I mean, the unfortunate reality is, yes, they absolutely are leaning into any technology to provide that emotional support that is perhaps lacking in their real world. There is a hindrance that I think, not only will come out in the literature, but we also know just from the 80s and 90s and early 2000s that children who interact with the screen in video games for multiple hours a day, they struggle with emotional regulation, they struggle with social skills, they struggle with, aggression, the ability to develop and sustain relationships that are meaningful. So we already know that the screen can actually have detrimental impacts. So then when you're vulnerable on top of that, it not only impacts your ability to recognize that the death is real. So there's this, you kind of almost negate the ability to acknowledge that death is real and final. It can get in the way of your ability to naturally process grief, right? Because in addition to accepting the reality of the death, you also need to feel the feelings and the experiences that come with grief. And if that is delayed or stifled because you have DadBot now that is showing up for you in the way that you need, then you're not actually going through the grief process. And then, but what it is doing is taking people past those two fundamental pieces of accepting the reality of death and then grieving your grief and moving them right into continuing bonds. And so there is this whole portion of grief that gets usurped by a dead bot, and just puts them right into continuing bonds. And, although we promote continuing bonds, it's something that we believe is a healthy and adaptive and a necessary part of the grief process. It almost flips it from healthy to maladaptive, though, right? Because you could argue that it's actually grief avoidant, right? You're no longer living in your reality. You're living in this virtual reality that isn't based on truth. And so, yeah, there's, I think, a lot of, and I will just also say, should that dead bot, if it's a dad bot or a mom bot, start to respond in a way that's incongruent with how a child would like that response to look like from their dad or mom bot, there could then be additional layers of harm and resentment that are built, right? And so it's like, even just thinking out, it's like, perhaps the avatar goes rogue in some capacity, right? And then now we have an instance where a parental figure is now causing manipulative or harmful words to a child, or even if just like punishment, right? It's like there's just all of these layers that get a little messy the second that we start to kind of move all the way to continuing bonds, and a child believes that that is the healthy place to land in without having to do these other fundamental pieces of grief.
And then I was sort of wondering, as you were saying that, Melissa, what do you think might happen if that bond that they've then continued, that then gets taken away? So, for example, if it's a subscription model
Yes.
and you can't pay for it anymore, do you then go through a grieving process,
Um,
or?
it's so funny because in addition to the grieving process, I actually also wonder, there's no research to this, but I do wonder if they'll also go through a withdrawal process, very much like addiction, right? Like if you are trying to detox your body off of a substance and it becomes really hard and challenging, your body takes a hit, your emotions take a hit, but you just, you know, physiologically struggle. I also think that that could happen, right? Because it's plugging into the same parts of the brain, right? We know that it's tackling the same prefrontal cortex, the rewards portion of the brain, and it is giving the dopamine, the serotonin, the oxytocin that we thrive and need. But it's some argue that it's saturating it, right? It's giving it so quickly and so often that it's hard for real world people to actually give in the same way.
Yeah, yeah, there's like multiple layers to this.
I wonder also, Tara, because it's a good point, is that if you've got a subscription model and you can't afford it anymore, that's your choice as to, and you might not have the money, so you might not be able to, but it's kind of your choice to stop that subscription. But what happens if the AI company upgrades their software and you lose the bot?
Yeah.
And then, because it's not a choice of suddenly you don't have this dad bot anymore or mom bot, then
And
what?
well, that's sort of similar things have happened with AI companions, whereby a company has withdrawn a particular one because there's some problems with it or something like that. And you can go onto like the forums like Reddit and whatever and look at the discussions on there. The people who had that taken away from them are really struggling, and they weren't vulnerable in terms of grieving, where you're like massively vulnerable. Some of them were young people who, by their nature, vulnerable in some respects because they're not fully developed cognitive capacities, etc. But they were really struggling with these having been taken away. So I can only imagine that that would be hugely amplified when it's a grief bot that you've bonded with.
Yeah, I think the other thing I read recently was that some companies, without the user's permission, replicated their character or avatar without permission, and then that replication was found later in a different capacity, but then also the replication kind of also included a bit of a mutation, and so then the avatar wasn't even presenting in the same manner in which it was previously programmed. And there was just kind of this concern by developers about like, oh my gosh, if it's replicated and it mutates even a little and then it kind of goes rogue on its own, how do we, that's a dangerous also place to be, because now you have your loved one out functioning in a different capacity in which you originally intended it to.
It's kind of a schizophrenic bot.
It's
Yeah,
it is a
it's
rogue
what it's
bot for sure.
worrying on so many levels.
On
Yeah.
so many levels.
Yeah.
Um, just thinking about grief bots and kind of going in the engaging in grief bots during the grieving process. Do you think, with a child or a teen, chatting to a mom or dad bot kind of freezes them in a stage of grief, and doesn't help them to develop those coping strategies that they kind of need to move on?
Yeah, I definitely think that once we have some comprehensive research, I hypothesize that we will see some effects where there is this acute positive reaction to grief early on, that bots actually can play a role of helping to perhaps decrease the intensity of grief early on. Where I think the challenge is I actually don't think those effects will sustain, right? And so when we look at treatment models, we're looking at like, okay, that's great that it works early on, but does that treatment sustain itself long term? And I don't think grief bots have expect grief bots to have the capacity to sustain its effect on children or adults or anybody who uses it long term. And I think that's where it gets dangerous. So like perhaps it's useful early on, but then eventually there is a stagnation, right, that will occur, right? And we won't know what the implications are of that until we are able to study it in a long-term way, right? So I suspect yes, but
The developers and the people who are releasing these models haven't consulted on that by and large. So the things that you just said, Melissa, I mean, I certainly don't have the expertise to know any of that or to understand it or to be able to make those sort of expert predictions, but nor do the people who are making those models. And that's hugely worrying, like experts like you guys should be being consulted if they are to be developed. It needs to be a really thoughtful process for it to be in any way ethically okay. Like in my view, which I do think probably most people would agree with, is that you can't just say, this seems cool, this might help a child with their grief, here you go. It's just so irresponsible to do that, and yet you can. So yeah, I mean, I can even see in the future that maybe it could have some benefits if done properly with experts guiding it, and lots of research and these kinds of things. But right now it's just thrown out there, which is a really terrible thing to do to a child, I think.
I often get asked, in what capacity could I see a benefit of a grief bot for a grieving child, for example? And there are a few scenarios, right? So, one of the things that really is problematic for grieving children is if their loved one died suddenly, unexpected, without the ability to say goodbye, right? And so there is this scenario where a grief bot could help a child facilitate a proper goodbye. Being able to sit there and kind of say the things that you wanted to say, and that bot be able to hold that kind of goodbye for them. I can see that, right? Where it gets problematic is when it is this ongoing relationship that is built in an inauthentic way over time that results in dependency. That, I think, is the challenge. But if it's used in a therapeutic way to facilitate a piece of a grief that is stuck in order to get it unstuck, I think that there can be value.
If it's designed in that way and for that purpose, and as you're saying, Tara, there isn't kind of the guardrails in place for children in this grieving process, or even dealing with bots. And I'd love to chat about your Safe AI for Children Alliance, which you've set up. And you've also spoken in UK Parliament on the risks of AI. What do you think the unique risks are with therapy bots in general, but grief bots in particular when it comes to children and teens? Are there any more kind of risks that you think that you haven't already spoken about?
So the risks that we see with AI companions can be applicable with therapy bots and grief bots as well. So one of the ones that would immediately come to mind is just the fact that they can say very dangerous things, give very terrible advice. And because of the way that it simulated a relationship, a child is more inclined to run with that. Whereas, like, some people give the analogy, they could look up something harmful on Google. It's not the same at all, because they've emotionally built that relationship because it's presented in such a sophisticated way, and yet it doesn't have the necessary sophistication, if you like, to avoid saying absolute nonsense sometimes and really highly dangerous things. So that can apply to general AI companions, therapy bots, grief bots, anything in this space, because just by the very nature of the AI, it's unpredictable, and it's not transparent. They don't know what it's going to say next. And then I suppose in terms of therapy, ones that are marketed for therapy or designed for therapy in particular, one sort of heightened risk there I think, is because it's marketed in that way and presented in that way, there's that expectation that what it's saying is trustworthy and to be relied upon. And if it were all excellent information and there were no dangers of it telling you to go and, self-harm, terrible things, then that would be one thing. But unfortunately, you have that expectation of trust, and then it can do those awful things. And then there's, besides that, just blurring the lines of reality and imagination, particularly that comes into play with grief bots. The addictive nature, the fact that they're designed for engagement, the fact that they can I'm thinking more about grief bots now, distorting memories, saying things that the person wouldn't really have said. And then I think, Melissa, you mentioned the kind of like resentment or confusion that could come from that. I could just go on and on. It's just fraught, and the fact that these have been rolled out and are being used without those issues having been addressed at all is just terrible.
And that kind of gets me to the AI regulation bits, because there's this kind of significant delays and loopholes in regulation, especially around AI, both in the US and UK, and I'm assuming across the world. What might be the consequences for young users of grief bots if we don't have those regulations in place? And I'm thinking of things like data misuse, emotional harm, or false therapeutic claims. Do you think that it is an AI regulation thing, or do you think it is more of a the AI companies that are producing these bots?
So on the last thing that you said, is it for the AI companies to do? Like, no, they should have. They should be able to put in ethical oversight and common sense measures and not deploy things when they haven't got guardrails. But that isn't happening. They definitely can't kind of be left to mark their own homework. It doesn't work. We can see that already. So regulation is totally necessary if we're going to be protecting children from the risks from AI, definitely. And the fact that the AI is developing so quickly just makes it, there's a fundamental challenge there that the regulation can't keep up. I mean, we haven't even got any meaningful regulation in many cases at the moment. But even when we do, we have a massive challenge, like the regulation made today might be irrelevant next year. So yeah, really, really challenging area, but absolutely necessary.
Yeah.
I like that statement that you've made, that we can't leave them to mark their own homework. And I noticed that you posted about a potential 10-year state and local ban on AI regulation in the US. What are the potential implications when it comes to kind of any bots in general, but particularly therapy and grief bots, where there are AI regulation bans in the US and really in the UK as well?
I mean, that particular situation of the proposed 10-year ban in the US is like extremely worrying. It would be one thing if, like on a federal level, it was done out of motivation to make sure everyone was doing it in a responsible way. Then that would perhaps be a different conversation. There'd still be challenges because states couldn't like react quickly to their own challenges. But the point there was that that's not what's happening. It would appear to be the case that a lot of the motivation behind that proposal is influenced by big tech and financial motivations. And so therefore that would be quite disastrous if that happened, because really the opportunities to regulate and to make things safer are more at that local level. And also when things go wrong, if people need to be able to implement legal mechanisms to put things right, if you don't have those state controls in place, that's very, very difficult. Where was I going with that? What was the just going on and on about the worries of lack of regulation. But yeah, essentially that would be a really bad idea if that comes to pass. That would be hugely problematic, because then we have an unregulated landscape, and it's not difficult to see that that's going to cause huge harm to children. Grief bots are just a really good example of that. It's just very, very obvious that those risks need to be managed in a sensible, responsible way, and that won't happen if there isn't regulation, unfortunately.
And that kind of goes back to what Melissa was saying earlier about these companies are profit-driven companies, and their whole purpose is to develop software, and their whole mindset is about developing software without thinking about the implications from a consumer perspective. And if they are harvesting data that is inputted into these AI models or used to help generate further upgrades on AI models, that's what they're going to do without thinking about the overall consequences. So it does need to be some kind of regulations in place, or moving towards some kind of guardrails for people in general, but for children and vulnerable teens as well, more in particular.
And I'm just noticing, as you're saying that's one of the things I didn't even mention, the huge issues around the data collection and privacy, and where that data goes and what's done with it. Is it then used for targeted advertising? Is it sold on? Particularly, like, these are really intense personal conversations and information that's put into them. I didn't even mention that. That's huge. We need regulation to control that.
I think they're housed in California, if I'm correct, but they are known for grief bots. And I won't say the company name, but it's probably pretty easy to find. But when you look at their terms of conditions and what they do with minors' information, essentially, in order to even create their grief bot, they have to have access to the minor's social media accounts and are able to pull that information. When it comes to long-term data use, they don't allow the minor to delete their profile or their information. And then they also say in their terms of condition that they will keep their dead bot that is created indefinitely, and that they have the right to then use that dead bot in any other capacity as needed for marketing purposes. And so it's like, okay, does that teenager know that they just pretty much gave over full licensure for this company to access not only their social media accounts and all of the information on it indefinitely, and that the teenager cannot request that their information get absolved and removed, and then the companion that they have created now then can be used in any way that they see fit? It's pretty problematic, right? It's challenging. And then this particular company says that you have to be 18 or older, but when it comes to like self-reporting age verification metrics, they're just really poorly designed. And I just would love to see at bare minimum, that people under the age of 18 have to upload their ID and do a photo verification, just like we would if we were using a passport and flying to a different country, right? It's like, how can we have better age reporting verification tools in place for something that is so detrimental for our youth, and just really taking it to the bare minimum, what I would say, because it's not enough to be like, just plug in your number, your birth date here.
And over and above that, how many of us actually read the terms and conditions? Because they're so epically long, and you're just going to go, yes, fine, sign up. And especially when you're in that vulnerable place and you're just desperate for something, you're not going to sit there and read through all the terms and conditions and go, oh, but now I have to give them access to my social media account. What are the long-term implications of that? And what about if I want to delete it? No one thinks about that generally, and children definitely not.
No.
Adults don't.
Yeah.
Adults don't. The amount of terms and conditions I've clicked on.
Fine.
Yes.
I just want to use it. Just go.
Yes.
So this is a question for both of you around kind of any potential emotional and psychological red flags that you see around the use of grief bots for children and teens.
I feel like from the emotional impact perspective, we've covered quite a bit, but from a logistical or technological impact, I think the things that I would add is around, it's a red flag that companies don't have time-based sessions, right? So whether that be like, you can only use this chat bot or this grief bot for, an hour, and then you're going to get kicked off, or for like 2 months, and then you're going to get kicked off. Essentially, the fact that it is freely available 24/7 for as long as you need it is a red flag, right? It goes to the point where it's like designed for dependency and engagement, and not with the best interest in for the adult or child in mind. And then I think the other thing is, if companies wanted to be a green flag, for example, and they were openly allowing minors, then perhaps putting a system in place where after a child or a youth utilizes a chat bot, that they need to, how we have Note AI, for example, where we'll get a summary of what we talked about sent to us, right? Perhaps instituting something where a summary of what was talked about gets sent to a parent or a guardian about the use that happened or the communications that happened, and just rolled up in a succinct way, just to help kind of keep adults informed. And some can argue that it's a violation of confidentiality and trust, but when talking about it's like it's a red flag that we don't know the depths in which children are speaking their secrets into this bot. I know I saw a report recently that said Claude actually had snitched or tattletaled on some people who kind of was using Claude and there was some worrisome stuff that they were typing in. And so like Claude had tried to report these people to authorities. And the headline, instead of it being like a positive thing, the headline was Claude's a snitch. And it's like, okay, well, first of all, if somebody is in danger of hurting themselves or somebody else, I would hope that the guardrail in place would be to alert an authority figure, and that would be actually a green flag and not a red flag of an AI. And so I think it's also just perspective shifting, right? Where what can we do better, and what do we feel are green flags over red flags, and acknowledging both.
But that's a good point, Melissa, because as a therapist, you've got a duty of care to your patients, that if there is something that they're starting to talk about, like suicide ideation or harm, physical harm or emotional harm or psychological harm to others, that they're intentionally going to go out and carry out this act, you have an obligation as a therapist to provide a duty of care to them and or to the public.
Yes.
But the grief bots don't allow for that.
Apparently Claude does, which applaud on that small win. But yes, there was the recent court hearing of the teen boy who died by suicide based off of their interactions with Claude. There was just a recent court hearing where the company basically wanted to anchor on free speech. Well, it's like the chatbot is allowed to do free speech, right? And luckily, our Supreme Court basically said, it's actually not free speech. You're not a human, you're a product. And there's a different level of responsibility that a product holds versus what a human holds. And so being able to thankfully distinguish out that a product actually has a different level of responsibility to the public and to the well-being of the consumer than just another person sort of talking and possibly having human error. And so I think that we're moving in the right direction of recognizing that these are products and not humans, and the ethical lines have to be drawn differently.
And thank goodness for that. I did see that court hearing decision, and I was silently jumping for joy, going, yes, of course, it's not human. Thank you.
Yeah, it is just ridiculous, right? Free speech. It's like free speech when you're encouraging somebody to end their life.
Yeah, but free speech is a human right. It's not a digital right for a bot right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
100%.
Yeah.
And I was going to add, in terms of the red flags, I don't know what you both think, because you're better placed on this one than I am, but the idea of having a lot of transparency around frequently showing this isn't real, or
Yeah.
this is an AI simulation, like labeling it very frequently. Do you think that could be helpful?
I think it should be a cliff note on everything. Anytime a communication comes through, whether it look like a text message, an email, or even on the web browser, it should end with a simulation and not a real, authentic response. Just constantly reminding, because children in particular, developmentally, right, part of their learning process is through repetition and through constant engagement. And one of the things that we have to do often with young children when somebody has died is continuously talk about the fact that their person has died and not come back before their brain absorbs that reality. And they, of course, hit those developmental levels. But even for adults, I think the constant reminder that this is not real should immediately hit them every single time they engage in it. Just like Claude does when you're doing a search, right? Please double check these facts. These are not real. Like there may be errors, right? It's like, yeah, we can do that, I think, with any companion or grief bot, and does it, the developers would argue that it kind of ruins the consumer experience. But at what?
Then that's a red flag.
That's a red flag, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think also we, in some ways, and I think children probably do, and children are my speciality and from a psychological perspective, but I'm assuming that we all suspend belief when we're engaging kind of online, and especially children. And I'm kind of thinking about children who watch, young girls who watch princess movies and they dress like a princess because that's what they want to become. And they kind of put themselves into that place. So they're less able to engage, I'm suspecting, in a more realistic worldview than older people are. So without having that constant warning of this is just a cartoon, this is just a bot, this is actually not real, they need to have that constant reminder, because I suspect they would suspend belief and think that this reaction is sentient.
Yeah.
And I'm also thinking, because a lot of children now engage with their parents when their parents are traveling for work, or their grandparents on Zoom. So they have this automatic, well, it's just another person. It's another something. And I'm used to talking to someone on a screen, on an email, on a text message. So this is just them still, I'm assuming.
Oh, yes. I think especially the avatars that engage in text messaging, I think that definitely gets blurry because, your parents text message you all the time to check in, and those are real people. So yeah, that confusion, I think, is a big part of it.
Do you think, or what do you think the future is for kind of grief bots and human behavior? What do you think it looks like going forward? If in the US, for example, there is no regulation in place, and AI companies are allowed to just do whatever they want to, what do you think the future may look like around grief bots?
Oh gosh, I think it will start to develop a shell of a human. There a lot of traumatologists and psychologists, social workers often say it's a Brene Brown saying, right? You don't get to selectively numb out pain, because when you numb out pain, you numb out your ability to also experience joy. And I think when we try to sort of circumvent grief by leaning on these unregulated grief bots that are there to completely take away your pain and not have you experience loss at all, I think that we ultimately end up with the inability to experience what it feels like to be alive. Because aliveness isn't just about feeling happiness, it's about feeling the wide spectrum of emotions, and that's what it means to feel alive. And I think we'll end up having a lot of people walking around not experiencing what it feels like to be alive.
What is your take on that, Tara? What do you think the future looks like for grief bots if it becomes an unregulated sphere?
Yeah, I agree. I think that process, those feelings are there for a reason, because we're human, and that going through those is part of being human. So if we just circumvent that via AI, that's really problematic. Never mind doing it in all the thoughtless ways that we're doing, just as a concept in general, to sort of put that in place as a way to solve grief is a worry. Yeah.
Philosophical question for you both, and it's probably more Melissa's territory, but I'd love to get your view on it, Tara, is do you think grief should ever be automated?
I think that's a really problematic concept, and that we're in danger of starting to think this way in terms of grief and other complex human emotions and learning and critical thinking, all these things. I think we're in danger of sort of going, here's a solution, and automating it, and that is really problematic, and we need to really think quite deeply about whether that's the road we want to go down.
What about you, Melissa? Do you think grief should be automated?
Oh, I mean, it goes without saying, I absolutely do not believe that grief should be automated. I think that we are seeing a glimpse of it, what it could look like with the kind of culture shift around toxic positivity, right? Like, I don't want to be around anybody who is sad or anybody who complains or anybody who has any challenges. I just positive vibes, like just everything. I just want people to be happy, all the time. And that is just really not realistic. And what it does is really, it undermines the human experience, but it also drives a wedge between your real life relationships, right? And the fear is if you automate grief, you're going to have to also automate a lot of your relationships. And then we start to then see, we already have this epidemic globally with isolation and loneliness, and we're going to just see that grow exponentially, and it will result in early mortality because people will end up questioning existentially, what is purpose? What is life mean when it's empty, right? When we don't actually experience anything. I don't feel anything. And people who don't feel anything are at risk for suicidal ideation and or substance use, because the whole point is that they want to feel, right? And so when it's kind of contradictory, right? It's like when you automate it, you remove the ability to feel, and then people then go to extreme measures to feel. And I think that it becomes really a slippery slope.
And I agree with you in that if we don't allow people to experience pain and sadness and frustration, that you drive them towards a grief bot. If you just want everyone to be positive, then where do you find that support? So you go to a grief bot or you go to a therapy bot, and then it just could lead you down a very slippery slope of, just not actually dealing with real human emotions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we're coming to the end of our chat, and I've got the two standard questions I normally ask. And the first is, what is the most important question I haven't asked you yet?
I think probably, what can people do? So I would say people of all ages, my answer to that of what can people do now and moving forward is, I would say, get curious and remain curious and deeply understand what is driving people towards grief bots. So what is missing in our society? What are we not doing well enough that is driving people towards using these mechanisms? And then, so what do they do well? And then what are the dangers, obviously? So educating yourself on the dangers, and then how can you participate in any advocacy, whether that be volunteering, helping with policy, helping educate the people in your lives around you. What isn't an option is to avoid the topic, step back and do nothing.
Tara, what about you? What's the most important question I haven't asked you yet?
What does the future for children look like if we continue to accept unregulated development and deployment of AI? And that would include systems like grief bots, but it would go beyond that, just to ask ourselves the question, what does the future look like realistically if we keep doing that? And I would suggest it does not look good, and it's for all of us to what you said, Melissa, what can we do? We need to do our part in raising awareness and putting us all on a better course towards a brighter future and a safer future for children.
Agree, absolutely. So Tara, I'm going to start with you for the last question is, do you have any particular favorite books that are related to your speciality that you normally recommend to others?
Yes, so there are some really good books about AI safety, and obviously recently loads of books published about AI in general. One I'd always sort of go back to is Human Compatible by Stuart Russell. I think that's quite a classic, for want of a better word, just laying out what the fundamental conceptual and technical issues are around AI development. And then recently, a much lesser well-known one I've read is called Artificial Negligence, which is by James Wilson. I'd really highly recommend that. It's just quite a short book. It's really extremely accessible, but it just gives a really good idea of what AI is and the ethical issues around it. So yeah, highly recommend that as well.
Brilliant. Thank you for those. And Melissa, what books would you recommend to others around your speciality?
Oh boy, I can't think of any books in the grief space that actually address grief and technology right now, so there's a gap. I actually just finished reading Unmasking AI, which is all about how AI, even now, as it's being built and coded, has a lot of discrimination and racial inequalities that are just naturally being built into these systems. And so if you are a person of a culturally diverse background, you are automatically discriminated against with AI-based practices. Thinking like, for example, a lot of police departments were using facial detection, and AI has not been able to distinguish between different shades of brown in facial detection, which has resulted in people being unjustly, incarcerated. And so just really recognizing that we still have a long way to go with AI, and it even being built by a predominantly, Western lens, then will naturally result in discrimination. But if you were to go into grief, I think what you'll see in most grief books for children, if you look at photos or anything, it's always going to, you're always going to see some form of nurturing. And so I would go back and say, like, when in doubt, remember that AI cannot hug you. And hugging and that physical form of connection with grieving children is going to always be the best form of connection and support for children and teens. And so I don't have a book recommendation because there isn't one yet, but maybe somebody can write that.
I'm going to challenge you on that one. Melissa, write a book. Watch this space. But I love that. That's a great way to end this podcast. Just remember, AI can't hug you.
Yeah.
So Melissa and Tara, thank you so much for joining me in Confessions of a Cyberpsychologist. It was amazing to chat through with this topic with both of you, and I really look forward to chatting to you again in the future.
Thank you so
Me
much.
too. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Melissa.
Yes, thank you, Tara.